Somewhere in a desert so dry that camels struggle to find water, engineers just switched on a machine that burns hotter than almost anything humans have built, and it doesn't need a single drop of water to do it. Picture a pool of glowing orange salt, hotter than lava, quietly turning a rock most of the world threw away, decades ago, into fuel that could last 1,000 years. No cooling towers, no pressurized water crashing through pipes waiting to fail. Just salt, heat, and a rock nobody wanted. Now picture that same country, a few thousand kilometers away, holding a miniature sun steady inside a ring of magnets, hotter than the actual star at the center of our solar system, for longer than any machine on Earth has managed before. And this is only the first 2 machines on the list. There are 2 more coming, and neither one involves splitting an atom at all, which is exactly what makes them stranger, and in some ways more important, than the 2 you just saw. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through 4 separate breakthroughs, built in 4 different corners of one country, each one solving a piece of the same puzzle. A reactor that runs on a rock, a star trapped inside a magnetic bottle, a battery built from something already sitting in your kitchen, and a satellite designed to catch sunlight where the sun never sets and beam it back down to Earth. Save that last one for later. It's the one that made physicists outside China sit up straight, because nothing else on this list gets you off the planet's surface entirely. If machines like this interest you, hit subscribe now, because we track breakthroughs like this as they happen, not months later once everyone else has already moved on to the next headline. Here's why any of this matters. Roughly 80% of the crude oil that keeps China's factories, cars, and power plants running has to pass through a single stretch of water, barely 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, the Strait of Malacca. Back in 2003, China's own leadership gave this vulnerability a name, the Malacca Dilemma. It describes a country with the world's second-largest economy, running its entire energy lifeline through a strait it does not control, patrolled by navies it cannot command. The nearest alternative routes, the Straits of Lombok and Makassar, add days to every shipment and still can't handle the largest oil tankers. China now consumes something like 15 million barrels of oil a day, and even with pipelines running overland from Russia and Central Asia, those routes still fall well short of covering demand, which means the sea lane through Malacca isn't a minor detail, it's the artery. One blockade, one accident, one act of coercion in that channel, and the lights across an entire nation start to flicker. That is the vulnerability sitting underneath everything you're about to see. Every reactor, every battery, every satellite in this video is, in one way or another, an attempt to make that one narrow strait matter a little less. Breakthrough 1 starts with a rock most nuclear scientists gave up on 60 years ago: thorium. On its own, thorium is almost boring. It won't sustain a chain reaction no matter how you stack it, kind of like a log that refuses to catch fire without a spark already sitting next to it. The spark here is a small amount of uranium already inside the reactor. Feed thorium-232 a neutron and it becomes thorium-233. That decays into protactinium-233. Wait long enough and it becomes uranium-233, the part that actually splits and releases energy. American scientists at Oak Ridge National Laboratory first proved this idea worked back in the 1960s, then abandoned it entirely, partly because a molten salt reactor is far harder to turn into a weapon than a conventional one, which made it less interesting to a Cold War military budget. China picked the idea back up in 2011 and spent 14 years grinding through the engineering problems everyone else walked away from. Engineers at the Shanghai Institute of Applied Physics figured out how to keep that entire chain running continuously inside a 2-megawatt test reactor near the city of Wuwei, out on the edge of the Gobi Desert. In November 2025, they confirmed something no other operating reactor on the planet had done: converting thorium into usable uranium fuel while the reactor kept running, without ever shutting it down. It's the nuclear equivalent of refueling a car while it's doing 70 on the highway. The reactor doesn't use water at all. Instead, it circulates molten fluoride salt at roughly 650 degrees Celsius at ordinary atmospheric pressure, so there's no high-pressure steam system waiting to fail if something goes wrong. If the core ever overheats, a plug of frozen salt melts on its own, and the fuel simply drains into a holding tank underneath. No control room panic, no emergency shutdown drama, just gravity doing the job quietly. As of right now, this small 2-megawatt unit is the only operating molten salt reactor on the planet actually loaded with thorium fuel, which is a strange thing to be first at, given the concept is more than 60 years old. China holds an estimated 280,000 tons of thorium reserves, and by some estimates, the deposits in Inner Mongolia alone could power the entire country for close to 1,000 years. Engineers are now scaling up, with a 60-megawatt thermal demonstration plant targeted for the end of this decade, and a commercial-scale 100-megawatt reactor penciled in for some time between 2030 and 2035. One that could produce hydrogen as a byproduct and eventually be exported to other countries along the Belt and Road. State research institutions have backed the program with more than $400 million since 2011, and nearly 100 research institutions are now involved in some part of it. A team that has grown from a few dozen researchers to more than 400. But a reactor that can run for 1,000 years on rock only solves part of the puzzle. What happens when instead of splitting atoms apart, you try smashing them together instead? That question sends us more than 1,000 kilometers east, to a lab outside Hefei, where scientists have built something they nicknamed the artificial sun. The machine is run out of the Institute of Plasma Physics, under the Chinese Academy of Sciences, in Hefei, a city that has quietly become one of the world's biggest fusion research hubs over the past 2 decades. Nuclear fusion is the reaction that powers every star in the sky, including ours. And for 70 years, it has been the energy source that's always 30 years away. Here's the basic idea. Take hydrogen, heat it past 100 million degrees Celsius, hotter than the core of the actual sun, and suspend it inside a donut-shaped magnetic field, so it never touches the walls of the container. Do that, and the hydrogen atoms fuse together and release enormous amounts of energy, with almost no long-lived radioactive waste, and the fuel is essentially seawater. The catch has always been holding that plasma steady long enough for it to matter. In January 2025, the experimental advanced superconducting tokamak, known as EAST, held a stable, high-confinement plasma for 1,066 seconds, more than 17 minutes, at over 100 million degrees. That obliterated its own previous record of 403 seconds, set less than 2 years earlier. Then, on January 1, 2026, the same machine cracked something called the Greenwald density limit, a theoretical ceiling physicists believed would make the plasma unstable if you packed in too much fuel. It didn't destabilize, it held. Picture trying to keep a soap bubble from popping while pumping more and more air into it, and somehow the bubble just gets stronger instead of bursting. That's roughly what EAST just demonstrated was possible. China is one of 7 members of the international ITER fusion project, now under construction in France, and every record EAST sets feeds directly into that shared effort. But Beijing isn't only playing on the international team, it's also racing its own separate machine. China is now pouring resources into the next reactor in line, called BEST, the Burning Plasma Experimental Superconducting Tokamak, targeting fusion ignition by 2027, a milestone only one other machine on Earth has ever reached, and that one used a single laser pulse rather than continuous operation. In July 2025, Beijing formed a new state-owned company, China Fusion Energy, backing it with $2.1 billion, on top of an estimated $6.5 billion already invested in the technology since 2023. And fusion research made the list of 8 frontier technologies in the country's latest 5-year plan. If BEST reaches ignition under continuous operation, China would be sitting on something no nation has ever had: a working blueprint for a power source that runs on seawater and leaves behind almost no waste. But a star in a magnetic bottle doesn't help you at all if you can't store the electricity it makes for the exact moment you need it. And that turns out to be a problem an entirely different material just solved. Breakthrough 3 isn't happening in a desert or a physics lab. It's happening somewhere closer to your kitchen cupboard, or at least, the raw material is. Lithium batteries have powered the last 2 decades of the energy transition. But lithium is scarce, expensive to mine, and concentrated in a handful of countries. Sodium is not. It makes up roughly 2.3% of the Earth's crust. You can pull it straight out of seawater, and it's the same element sitting in your salt shaker. For years, sodium-ion batteries were dismissed as a lab curiosity, too heavy and too weak to matter commercially. That changed fast. CATL, the world's largest battery maker, has quietly run a sodium-ion battery station outside Tianjin, in Hubei province, since 2024. It's roughly the size of 15 soccer fields, and it has been feeding a real power grid, storing enough electricity for around 12,000 homes, this entire time without most of the world noticing. In June 2026, CATL unveiled its next-generation system, called Tenor Sodium, at an event in Munich, calling it the world's first field-validated sodium-ion storage system. The specs are almost boring in how solid they are. Over 15,000 charge cycles, stable operation anywhere from -40 to 70 degrees Celsius, and no thermal runaway even when engineers deliberately crushed the cells, punctured them with nails, or overcharged them on purpose. Try that with most lithium cells, and you'll usually get fire. On the transportation side, CATL's Naxtra-branded sodium-ion cells for passenger cars and trucks now reach an energy density of around 175 watt-hours per kilogram, close enough to standard lithium iron phosphate cells that a sodium-powered car can realistically cover more than 500 kilometers on a single charge. And the cells have already cleared China's newest national safety standard for electric vehicle batteries, the first sodium chemistry ever to do so. CATL is targeting a full gigawatt-hour of sodium battery shipments by the end of 2026, with deliveries to Chinese customers beginning in September and a 60 gigawatt-hour supply deal already signed with the storage integrator Hyperstrong. And CATL isn't working alone. BYD is building its own massive sodium-ion production facility, and the technology has already started showing up in low-speed electric vehicles and battery-swapping scooters in cities like Shenzhen, which means the supply chain being built here isn't limited to giant grid stations. It scales all the way down to a 2-wheeler delivery driver charging up between shifts. Think of it less as a replacement for lithium and more like a second engine bolted onto the same car, one built from a material China will effectively never run short of. And once a country can generate power from rock, from a star in a bottle, and store it cheaply in something scooped out of the ocean, there's only one direction left to point all of that ambition: up. This is the one that made scientists outside China sit up straight. At Shidian University in Xi'an, a team led by engineer Duan Baoyan has spent over a decade building towards something that sounds like science fiction: a solar power station in orbit, beaming electricity down to Earth through open air. The project is called Zhuri, which translates roughly to chasing the sun. Here's why space matters so much. A solar panel on a rooftop sees maybe 8 or 10 hours of usable sunlight a day, less on a cloudy day, and even the best terrestrial solar farms only convert sunlight into usable electricity around 20 to 25% of the time when you average across a full year. Park that same panel in geostationary orbit, 36,000 kilometers up, and it sees the sun nearly around the clock, with no clouds, no atmosphere, and up to 6 times the solar intensity hitting the same square meter of panel. In May 2026, the team ran a test on a 75-meter tower at their Xi'an campus, wirelessly transmitting 1,180 watts of power across more than 100 meters using a tightly focused microwave beam, with 20.8% of the original electricity successfully making the full round trip and coming out usable on the receiving end. They didn't stop at a stationary target either. A drone flying at 30 kilometers an hour pulled in a steady 143 watts of power from 30 meters away, live, mid-flight, like charging a phone without ever plugging it in, except the phone is airborne and the charger is aiming at it from across a parking lot. The long-term plan is enormous. China is working toward a solar array roughly 1 kilometer wide, sitting in geostationary orbit, large enough that a single gigawatt-class station could power a mid-sized city entirely on its own, around the clock, regardless of weather on the ground below. The next milestone the team has publicly flagged is moving these tests into orbit itself. No country has demonstrated this at meaningful scale yet, though Japan's Ohisama project, the United States through Caltech's earlier orbital demonstration, and the European Space Agency's Solaris program are all working towards similar tests of their own, which makes this less a solo race and more a crowded field, with China currently pushing the largest publicly stated array size. On the ground, the receiving side of this system is essentially a giant mesh antenna, called a rectenna, spread out like a net over a field, quietly converting an invisible beam of microwaves back into ordinary electric current, no different in principle from your microwave oven heating a bowl of soup, just aimed outward instead of inward, and scaled up by a factor of millions. If China gets there first, catching sunlight where the sun genuinely never sets, and beaming usable power back down through open sky, it would be sitting on an energy source not bound by geography, by weather, or by any strait anywhere on Earth. Look at these 4 machines side by side, and a pattern starts to show. A reactor that turns forgotten rock into 1,000 years of fuel. A magnetic bottle holding a miniature star steady longer than anyone thought possible. A battery built from the same element sitting in your kitchen. And a satellite designed to pull sunlight out of a sky that never goes dark. It's worth being honest here. These 4 programs didn't start as one coordinated master plan sketched out on a single whiteboard somewhere in Beijing. They grew out of different institutes, different funding cycles, even different decades of research. Some borrowed from abandoned American science, some built from scratch. But they all attack the exact same underlying weakness. And they all end up feeding the exact same wire, the same national grid that keeps factories running and cities lit through the night. A country that can pull power from a rock, a star, a kitchen ingredient, and empty sky is a country that no longer needs a fleet of tankers threading a 3-kilometer-wide strait it doesn't control. Strip away the individual specs, and each one is really answering the same question from a different angle. Where does the next kilowatt come from when the old answer, foreign oil moving through a choke point you don't control, stops being reliable? And that's where this stops being a science story and turns into a power story. Energy independence isn't just about lower electricity bills, it's about leverage. A nation that isn't held hostage by a choke point, a pipeline, or a foreign oil producer is a nation that can act with a freer hand on the world stage, whether that's in a trade negotiation, a military standoff, or a climate summit. The people watching all 4 of these programs most closely right now aren't only scientists chasing curiosity. They're policymakers in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and New Delhi, quietly asking the same question. If China solves its energy dependency before anyone else does, what does the rest of the global balance of power look like in a world where the old choke points simply stop mattering as much? It's also worth remembering that plenty of these programs are still years, in some cases a decade or more, from full commercial scale, and every other major economy, from the United States to the European Union to Japan and India, is racing toward its own versions of these same technologies, sometimes further ahead in one category and further behind in another. So nothing here is settled yet, and the finish line keeps moving as fast as the funding does. That's the real story behind the headline. 4 separate bets on 4 different branches of physics, all pointed at the same finish line. If you want to keep tracking which one crosses it first, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. Out of the reactor, the fusion star, the battery, and the satellite, which one do you think actually gets there first? And which one do you think the rest of the world should be racing hardest to catch up on?